fanfare for the common men. If you remember the 60s, they say, then you can't have been there. The Doctor remembers the 60s. That's why he's taking Nissa on a trip back to November 1963. Back to where it all began. Back to the birth of the biggest band in the history of British music. Back to see those cheeky lads from Liverpool. Mark, James and Corky, the common men. The boys who made the 60s swing with songs like Oh Won't You Please Love Me, Just Count to Three, and Who Is That Man? The Doctor remembers the 60s, and there's something very wrong with the 60s if the Beatles no longer exist.
Coming soon from Big Finish Productions, Doctor Who, 1963, Fanfare for the Common Men.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome the year's top pop sensation.
This is what I was talking about, Nissa.
Why is everyone making so much noise, Doctor? We can't even see them yet.
This is what the Beatles inspired in people. Good grief.
What is it, Doctor?
It's not them.
Who are these Beatles then? Are they another group?
Yes.
Are they any good?
You must have heard of them.
Well, nobody's as good as the Common Men.
The Common Men!
You haven't landed us in the wrong place, have you, Doctor?
No, 31st of October 1963. This is definitely right. Something is very, very badly. Get down!
Cheers, we've been the Common Men and will continue to be so tomorrow.
Subscribers get more at bigfinish.com.
So, Philip, what stands out to you about this story?
I think the whole trilogy, it's an interesting concept in terms of wanting to celebrate an anniversary and deciding, well, we'll go for 1963, which is when Doctor Who starts. And so, getting three very experienced writers to pick three incidents in 1963, which were key. And so the first one that Eddie's picked is in terms of what was big and happening in the 1960s. Well, the biggest thing, well, aside from Dalek Mania, bigger than probably Dalek Mania was Beatlemania. Because the Beatles were just becoming bigger and bigger. Now, in 1963, they were still only just starting off, but of course, soon the whole era was going to be totally dominated by the Beatles, and so it's a natural storyline to go for, is to go with the Beatles. But we do know that the Beatles appeared in Doctor Who in the chase, but of course, when you're dealing with once again people who are still alive, because both Paul and Ringo are both still alive. It's very hard to, well, where do you go and how do you take it and how do you play around with those sort of things? And so I think Eddie's done a really clever thing in terms of, let's take the Beatlemania, but transcribe it to another group. And of course, the group is described to people who know the very first episode of The Unearthly Child. Susan was listening on her radio to the Common Men playing a tune when I think Ian walks in on her, which of course is a totally fictional group. But it's just a very funny thing to actually, take something that happened in that very first episode and then turn into a whole storyline. So, yeah, in terms of my initial impressions with this, well, I love the music. They're singing in this. So some musical tracks, which, it's hard for Big Finish to do because it's so expensive and so time-consuming to put down music. But they managed to get, three actors who could all sing really well and some great tracks that were written for it. And so it's all throughout this you've got bits of songs, but really in the style of the Beatles. And so one of the great joys hearing artificially created Beatles songs.
That's great.
We've just had a new Beatles song released for the first. I'm not sure what you think of the new Beatles song that's just been released. But yeah, it's great having that sort of honor and picking up on the sort of strands of what the Beatles were, their sounds, their vibes, and to put into this group. What were your initial impressions?
No, I loved it. I love the Beatles, and it's interesting. Our rabbit hole topic was talking about what kind of events were brought out in Doctor Who stories that we remember. You may not think at our age that the Beatles had any events, but the first big Beatles event that I recall in my lifetime was the 20th anniversary of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. It was 1987. So that was that would have been my third year in high school, I think it was. Yeah, it was my third year in high school. And it was the first time I'd heard and they're one of their later albums, because my dad always liked the early stuff, the 1963 style poppy tunes that the Beatles did in their first few albums. But I got a taste for Sgt. Pepper's and really explored the Beatles' later period on my own, because it was something that my dad didn't like. So in that sense, the Beatles, and there's always been Beatles events, hasn't there? That there's, even during our lifetime, whether they were off doing solo things, whether, John was, he was assassinated.
Paul McCartney's has done a big tour of Australia, and it's been huge, and tens of thousands of people. But I remember I slept overnight outside the Sydney Entertainment Centre 30 years ago to get tickets for Paul McCartney. And I was fourth row, dead centre. But, I'd slept the night with a couple of friends so we could get those seats and see Paul McCartney back then. And I still think I'm slightly industrially deaf from Live and Let Die, because they had explosions going off and fireworks and the heat being generated by all this flame and the sound of Live and Let Die. It's still one of the highlights. I can close my eyes and see that whole song being performed. It was unbelievable. And Paul McCartney was amazing 30 years ago. And I heard he was pretty good even now. Though I didn't go this time because, it wasn't. I didn't have the high fourth row seats.
Fantastic. But as far as Fanfare for the Common Men goes, I really like the way this is a very timey-wimey story. We've mentioned it before that Doctor Who often doesn't deal with the effects of time travel at times, but this story does, and I really appreciate that. There's a quirkiness in Eddie Robson's writing that really appeals to me too. Every time I see his name, I feel a sense of quirkiness that I don't get from any other writer. So he always does something that's really interesting, I find, when he writes. So, it was good to be able to have a chat with him about this and a chat about some of his other stuff too, which we'll share down the track. Yeah.
You do have to focus pretty hard on this because, as you said, it's timey-wimey, and it's more than just two times, because the Doctor and Nyssa are separated for nearly the entire story. They actually have, that Sarah and Peter have hardly any scenes together. They're both working with other people and moving through time in different ways. You are constantly having to try and think, oh, hang on, where are we now? Who are we? And they're fairly short, punchy scenes. So you do really have to keep focusing on what's happening next. It is one that requires a lot of concentration, but it really pays off. And there's a lot of great moments throughout, but then a really good payoff at the end as well.
Excellent. Well, on that note, why don't we bring Eddie Robson on and have a chat to him about Fanfare for the Common Men?
So, Eddie, can you tell us how you came to be commissioned for Fanfare for the Common Men?
Yeah, no, this was this took a while actually, because the idea was actually suggested to me by a writer called Dara Carville, who writes for TV, who is a Who fan who created a show called The Bay, which is on ITV over here. And he's also a big Beatles fan like me, and he'd said, "Why don't you pitch to Big Fish? They've never done like a Beatles story." And he thought like a good place to locate it would be pre-Fame. When they were in Hamburg. And I thought that was a good idea. And I floated this with Big Finish. And they were a bit, oh, no, maybe. But they were a bit, I can't remember which came first, whether they kind of put it on the back burner and said, oh, maybe we'll talk about it. Or they came up with this idea. It would have been Alan Barnes who came up with the thing, because he'd said, we're a bit wary, understandably, of doing anything that intersects with real people who are still alive. Because it's not that you legally can't, but it could get you in hot water potentially. And the other issue, actually, yes, no, this is the reason why we went pre-Fame for it, was that we thought, well, it'd be a bit rubbish to do something about the Beatles and not be able to have any of the music. It would be very conspicuous. So if you locate it before they're famous, when they're still playing cover versions, then you could do it wouldn't feel as you still wouldn't be able to, on a Big Finish budget, do the cover versions, but you could do some pastiche obscure 50s rock and roll numbers, and it wouldn't feel as jarring as just sort of like saying, hey, it's the Beatles, and then you suddenly like don't actually have the music. And I think what those two things, the rights issues with the music, but also not wanting to deal with real people when they're alive. I think it was Alan who came up with the solution that would solve both of those, which was what if it's about the Beatles being kind of time rammed out of history? And that means that we don't have to. It's not the real people. We can cut and do it in a kind of a way, a bit like the the film The Ruttles,
Yep.
where it's like the Ruttles takes place in this kind of world because it's a parody of the Beatles. It takes place in this world where the Beatles don't exist and instead the Ruttles exist. Um, I think that was really the germ of it. Actually, was coming up with that. Um, and then at the same time, that might have been an idea that we came up with at the time, or the 1963 concept had come up because I think that was it. I know it's something that I'd floated with them a while back, and it had been like, oh, I'm not sure, it's a bit difficult. How can we do this? And I think it was Alan who came and said, is there a significant thing that is specifically November 1963, that we could tie this to the whole 1963 concept, because they had the other things that were going on right around the broadcast of the first episode. And I said yes, because the event that there'd been like big sort of Beatlemania things happening all throughout the year, really, particularly over the summer. But it was in November 1963 that they played the Royal Command performance, and the scenes outside that I think were the first time that it was described as Beatlemania. So that was a significant event. And I said, yeah, we could tie it around that. Um, and Alan was quite happy that, like, as long as it kind of started there, he was happy for me to go off and do it in other ways. Um, because I was quite keen to not just set it around that. I thought if you got this opportunity, it'd be quite nice to kind of explore it in different ways. But he was happy that, like, yeah, as long as it starts in November 1963, you can go off on a different tangent.
So where did you love the Beatles come from?
Oh, I don't know. It was kind of yeah, just growing up in the 90s. I kind of I hit 16 around the time when Britpop was really big in the UK. And the Beatles anthology documentary was coming out. And yeah, it was suddenly it was very 60s music had become very fashionable. And I don't know. I got recently into Jimi Hendrix through a friend, and then I just started looking into, what else, other 60s music. And I remember clearly, actually, I got a gift voucher for Christmas, which I'd been given to buy a particular Smashing Pumpkins album. And I went to the shop and it was out of stock. And I just went, oh, I'll just get something else. And I got Sergeant Pepper instead. And so that was it, really. So it was just that. And, reading, there was a book called Revolution in the Head by Ian MacDonald, which I got out of the school library because I actually I was a prefect working in the school library. I could just renew it myself. And so I had it out on loan for like a year. Nobody else could read that book because I just had it the entire time, and would just yeah, it's sort of got an entry for each song, so I would, I'd often kind of refer back to it.
So where did your you told us the initial idea for what about the title, the fanfare for the common men?
Yeah, that was, I can't remember what we were calling it initially. I think I did struggle a bit for a title for this one. And it wasn't until I think it was partway through the developing the storyline that it was early on. It was just like they could be anyone. They're just a band. Um, we hadn't come up with the idea that it would be the Common Men, and then I at one point I just suddenly thought, like, we couldn't. I was struggling for a name, I think, for the band and for a title for the play, and one that sounded right. Um, and then I just suddenly said, "Oh, what if they're the Common Men? Can just give us another link into the first episode because we don't know anything about them." Um, and yeah, and everyone just thought, yeah, that's great. And then and I think the title after that came from Alan Barnes. He said, oh, why don't you call it? Why don't you call it that? So yeah.
Then you've got the links with the Beatles appearing Doctor Who in the chase. You've
Mm.
got this backwards and forwards between the two. I guess the big 60s institutions.
Yeah, and we'd sort of decided, we've established that this group did exist in the Doctor Who universe, even when time had been put back as it should be. they're still there. They're still part of everything.
So how do you go about constructing a story that's so timey-wimey complex? How do you plot it out and plan it out?
Yeah, it was well. The main thing I wanted to do was because to get the most value out of the concept, I wanted to do the Beatles in different time periods, and I thought, well, I'll do an episode on each. And when I broke it down, I wanted them kind of quite spaced out to represent all the different phases. So I did, Beatlemania. I did '67 psychedelic era. I wanted to do the breakup and then actually and go back to the original concept, which was to have see them in Hamburg. And that actually just fitted quite well, I think, in the end, because when you get to the point and they realise that everything's unravelled and they have to undo it at source, um, that was that was the logical thing to do, was to kind of do it progressing through time chronologically, and then at the end they have to go back to 1960 to try and sort it out. And that was another thing that worked because knowing things about the Beatles' history, um, there were other groups from Liverpool who were in Hamburg at the time, and so that was quite easy to make that like the nexus point of like that's when things changed, and that's when they took over, because that was basically when the Beatles got good, was when they went to Hamburg. They hadn't played loads of gigs before then, and they were a bit rough and ready, and they were not known in Liverpool as being a particularly good group at the time. In fact, when one of the other Liverpool bands who were in Hamburg heard that the Beatles were being sent over, they sent a letter over saying, "Don't send the Beatles. It'll just ruin the scene if you send over a rubbish group like the Beatles." Um, and yeah, but it was those hours of playing in Hamburg that turned them into a really good group. And then when they got back to Liverpool, the difference was huge. And so that was the obvious point to kind of to make it work. I mean, I think with changing history stories, there's always a question of when history changed and like how people notice. And I'm never sure whether that completely logically makes sense. I think you just have to sort of not worry about that too much. Um, yeah, like why the Doctor lands at this particular moment and finds history has been changed, and why he's never had that happen before, I don't really know. I think just for the sake of the story and exploring the kind of the alternative past, you just have to kind of say, well, it just does, it just happens.
For a show that it involves time travel, Doctor Who travels a lot through time, but it doesn't often play with time like you have done in this story. So do you find that a challenge or difficult, or is that a lot of fun for you? And what about the plotting of everything? You've got the historical facts, but do you have the whole story in your head, or do you have to actually write these kind of things out because it's a bit more complicated?
Yeah, it is. It is a bit more complicated, I think, because because you want to, if you do want to work, the whole fun of doing an alternative history thing is to work with the original history, but also change it. Um, yeah, I mean, I think I agree with you that Doctor Who has actually very rarely dealt with it. It's usually just kind of time travel as a device to just get to a story and then do it. And uh, it's interesting. Yeah, it does kind of show that actually the mechanics of time travel are not necessarily really integral to Doctor Who, in the way that they might be in other stories. Um, I think the biggest challenge actually with these things is making it feel like something of importance has happened afterwards. Because if the Doctor just goes back and just undoes it, then it can feel a bit sort of unimportant, really. So I think you have to, especially if like you end up with characters who don't remember it. Um, but I think with this one, I did sort of come with that challenge with this one, because they do end up going back and undoing it at the source. But I guess it's the story ends up being about the Doctor working out what they need to do to undo it, really. And also just, I mean, I guess what you end up doing is going like, okay, so what, even if it doesn't change things, even if you've just kind of reverted to the status quo, what have we learned about the status quo in the process? And actually, that was something where I did kind of sit down and I was trying to work out when I came up with the idea that someone has tried to time around the Beatles out of existence to kind of take advantage of the position that they had. Um, I can't remember what exactly it was that I did. There was some early development of the story, and I was talking to my friend James Corey Smith, who's also written on Doctor Who and is a big Beatles fan about this. I was talking to him about what I was going to do about it, and he'd pointed out, well, there's an interpretation of that story that you've come up with, which is that it didn't matter who the Beatles were; they could have been anybody, but the times were right for someone like that to come in and take that position. And he pointed out to me, "You don't believe that's true, though, do you?" And I said, "No, I don't actually, because I think it was like a combination of a special version, bunch of talents at a particular moment that all and the circumstances enhanced it. But they couldn't have just been anybody." And he said, "Yeah, right. So that should be what the story's about: is that someone tries to do that because they think, oh, it could have been anyone. We just have to kind of like remove the Beatles and put some other people in their place." But it's about the fact that it constantly, if the villain is constantly going like, "Why isn't this working?" He feels it should work, and it's not. So even though the Beatles aren't in it, it's kind of a story about them and what they were and what we kind of would have lost by having them. Even if we'd had something else instead, what would have been lost if you hadn't had them? So I guess that's what I was trying to kind of get at in the end with um, removing them and then just undoing it again. It's a Wonderful Life thing, isn't it? It's like it's all undone and nothing actually has changed after George Bailey comes back, but he has a different perspective on his life having come back.
I couldn't help but think of other ideas that have come after this that remind me a bit of your story. In Rosa, we've got the villain that comes back and tries to change history in the past for his own reasons. But more particularly, I thought of the film Yesterday, which came out much after your story. I wondered if whoever wrote Yesterday had listened to this and got some ideas from that, because that was also a replacing the Beatles story, slightly different take on it, but similar. How often do you as a writer, how often do you come across ideas that kind of seem to be pinched from you, or ideas that sort of come out of that same collective kind of consciousness?
Yeah, I don't know. It's not happened that many times with me. It has happened from time to time. And yeah, you do sometimes look at things and go, huh. But with this one, actually, lots of people, when Yesterday was announced, lots of people said, "Hey, didn't you already write this story?" And I don't know. It's the thing is, to me, it's a when I didn't think, oh, he's nicked my story. I definitely didn't think that. I do think, as you say, it's a collective consciousness thing. It's not a completely out of the blue thing to kind of think, what if a big thing that happened hadn't happened? And yesterday I've not seen Yesterday because I actually think it will probably just annoy me as a Beatles fan. Because like even just hearing of the concept, I was just like, how does like so if everyone's just forgotten the Beatles, then where have everyone's Beatles records gone? Because apparently that's what Curtis said. But like, wouldn't the world be really different if the Beatles hadn't happened? It was like, oh, okay, but that means it's not that they just people have just forgotten the songs and are like, well, has Paul McCartney just woken up and wondered, why do I live in a huge house? And like, what are all these records that I've been making for 60 years that I can't remember? Yeah. So no, I didn't watch that, but it's a very different take on it. It is like, yeah, someone, I know there is that thing of like someone trying to take the place, but it's a fundamentally different thing. And actually the question which I found, because actually Yesterday I think was originally the guy whose script it originally was, he had a different take on it as well, which was that someone finds that the Beatles songs don't exist and he goes, well, I'm going to record them all, and then he's frustrated because he still can't get anywhere with them because they're out of context. Like they're still great songs, but it's a different time, and they're not going to suddenly make him famous like they made the Beatles famous. Um, and then Richard Curtis just threw that out and came up with a completely different take on it. So yeah, it's just an irresistible thing, really. It's not something I really worry about. I've done so many things. I've pitched so many ideas. Like the whole story of my career in TV has been going to people and saying, "How about this?" And they go, "Oh, we like it, but we've got something similar in development." And there's that people always have something similar. There's always a similar idea out there. So it's something I feel like it would be hypocritical of me to get too worried about that and to get angry about it. Unless it's a case where you feel like, yes, that's definitely, you can just sort of see the shape of your story underneath. But I've never encountered that really.
Music plays a huge role in this story, and I guess Barnaby Edwards was the natural person to come to direct it. And
Yeah.
the music score by Howard Carter is just classic in terms of how he
Mm.
managed to catch it, and there's even songs, which is very unusual Big Finish.
Yeah.
Were you happy? Were you happy with how the production was actually put together?
Yeah, I was really happy with that. I mean, it was something where they did ask me, "Do you think you could write the songs?" And I'm like, "I have no musical ability at all." So yeah, Barney did the songs, and he did that. It was very clever because he not only went on a Beatles pastiche, but he also said, "Well, on top of that, and to make it a little bit different, we've heard a bit of the Common Men's music in An Earthly Child, and the style of that track that they use to stand in for the Common Men is very like the Shadows." Um, and so he said, "So what if we kind of say they're a band? If we try and merge what the Beatles were doing in 1963 with the kind of records the Shadows were making in 1963 and trying to come up with something that was halfway between the two, which A, made sense, and B, I think just kind of meant that it wasn't too close to either that anyone might have kind of wanted to sue us over it. It was sort of, it gave it its own feel.
Is that why you had the line, "Don't tell Cliff Richard"?
But yeah, I actually might have had a go myself. A couple of years ago, as a sort of pandemic midlife crisis thing, I started learning the guitar, and I think I possibly might be able to knock out some Beatles pastiches now. I would have been tempted to do it myself if I was doing it today, but I certainly didn't have the ability to do it back then. I wouldn't have done it as well as Barney did it. Um, so yeah, as I say, I think they did a fantastic job because, as I say, the big stumbling block with the story was always, what about the music? What do you do for music? And they on the resources that we have, because music is so expensive, especially when especially when you're dealing with it on you release these things on CD. So for licensing purposes, I think they are often discounted as like, well, it's not really any different from a music CD. Um, so which I think like makes it more difficult, if anything. Um, and they did a fantastic job of giving it a kind of a whole sound that evokes the Beatles in the period.
I mean, the harmonies are just perfect. Now, the thing that struck me listening to this again was the scenes are so short.
Mm.
It just moves from scene to scene to scene to scene. Um, what was the choice in making such very quick changing scenes all the time?
I don't know actually. I didn't. Is it? I didn't realize it was noticeably shorter than on other ones. I don't know. It might have been that I was because I was doing the whole because it was kind of plotted as a series of like one part stories, maybe, that I was doing that. I don't know. Or maybe it was just that it was sort of just seeping in from the period that I was trying to convey that sense of things because because things did move very fast for the Beatles. It's always fascinating when you go back and look at things and just sort of say, what they were doing 6 months earlier would often be completely different from what they were doing at that moment. And maybe that was just trying to sort of absorb that into it. I don't know. Maybe. Yeah. No, hadn't. I didn't struck me at the time that the scenes were very short. I guess I was also trying to give a lot of characters a bit of time in the sun. One issue that came up quite quickly was that like the standard cast for a Big Finish is eight. And I was already coming up with the challenge of like, so I've got Doctor Nissa. I'd already come up with the idea that there would be a villain who'd be the manager figure, and then I needed a band of four to replace them. And I thought, wow, that's already seven characters, and that only leaves me like one spare character to do everything else because I will need other characters at some point. But on top of that, it was quite awkward to kind of have, well, the Doctor and Nyssa are the main characters, and then trying to give time to four other characters who were kind of operating as one character in a way because, like, their space in the story was kind of one space. And again, it was James Corey Smith. I was complaining about this to him and saying like, this is a real pain in terms of plotting. And he said, "Well, why don't you make it that one of the things?" At one point, I was saying, I was wondering whether should we have a joke that like their version of George, because George was always dubbed the quiet one. I was like, do we have one who's the quiet one and he doesn't speak at all? But no, James Corey Smith said, just make that one of the points of difference is that it's not a Fab Four, it's a Fab Three. And that was brilliant because I was like, yes, actually, that still lets me do everything I want to do, and it just adds to the weirdness of it. And so it does mean that there kind of isn't one based on George. So I've got one based on John Paul and Ringo each, and then yeah. I don't want this to sound like harsh on George, but it kind of the dynamic still worked fine in terms of the play. The dynamic of the Beatles would have not worked without George, but the dynamic for the play actually worked well with just those three as they were. Because you've got like John and Paul kind of doing the creative tugging between them, and then the Ringo figure is kind of the peacemaker and the one who's sort of refereeing. So that worked quite well.
Because George was the best of all four when it comes to writing music, but it was
you think?
it was Paul and John who were the personality of the band. But yeah, I definitely think George was the best songwriter. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, that could be hotly debated. That could be. I mean, they're all brought to different dynamics and different. Yeah, they open up music in very different ways. Anyhow, we're not a Beatles podcast. That is fascinating. The other decision you take very quickly too is to separate the Doctor and Nyssa. I mean, they're hard to get a scene together. Like, but it really gives Nyssa a lot of power.
Yeah. Well, it is quite good. It's I think that was probably when I think back to it, I think that was probably down to having all these quite significant characters that I wanted to give all the band members a reasonable amount of time. And actually, I think probably it would have when they were together, they did kind of merge into one character, and so I think it quickly became apparent that splitting up the Doctor and Nyssa so that one of them could be, I could maybe have like the different band members with them and like kind of interrogate those characters through the regular characters. That was, I think that's probably why I ended up splitting them up so much. But also, I think I'll just be rewatching season 20 because of the Blu-ray coming out. And I'm quite struck by how, because you've as well as Arc of Infinity, Tegan goes off and is the villain for most of Snake Dance, so she's not part of the thing. And the Doctor and Nyssa do really work quite a lot, as there is a sense that he puts trust in her, and he kind of he doesn't have to kind of explain everything to her all the time, and he sort of trusts her to do things, and they do kind of operate quite effectively as like a real investigative team. I think, particularly in Snake Dance, they are, they're a real kind of sort of detective pairing, sort of like science detectives. They're going around trying to work stuff out. So I think that that really felt. It felt like she's a character who actually you can give a lot of agency to in the stories. You feel like you can sort of use her as a surrogate doctor a lot of the time.
So, is there anything that you would like to change about the story or revisit with the story?
I don't know. I don't really. No, probably not. I don't really give that much thought to things in that way. My take tends to be that once it's done, and like I'd rather move on to the next thing. So, no, I don't know. I think probably the only thing is that, like, if I was doing it now, I probably wouldn't just say, "Oh, I'll write the songs myself," but I actually would have quite liked to collaborate a bit with Barney on them, and maybe I could have actually I can't remember how they were done in the end. I think they were, we sort of built up. Did Howard build up the tracks? I think I don't know. I don't know who actually put the tracks together, and then we got the cast members to come and quickly apply vocals to them on the day of recording. But yeah, I would have quite liked to have been involved and played a bit of guitar on them. That would have been quite good.
Great. Listen, thank you so much for your recollections of this story. And yeah, for creating a great story for the 50th anniversary.
If you enjoyed what you heard in this clip from the Sirens of Audio podcast, be sure to subscribe and click that notification bell so you never miss out on another episode from us. And if you want to find out more about us, including our back catalogue of episodes, you can head over to sirensofaudio.com.